In this lesson, you'll learn 5 easy techniques for suggesting trees in watercolor. I'm using a 1/16 sheet of watercolor paper, but this is also a great time to use the back of a painting that you don't want to keep. Before we begin, you may have noticed that I have some contamination in my paint wells, so let's review how to remove that. I'll take a sponge and place it along the edge of the well, tip my palette, and use my spray bottle to rinse off any of the color that doesn't belong in that particular well. This is a quick and easy way to make sure that I have clean paint when I start, and yet I don't have to be too concerned about contaminating the paint wells while I'm in the middle of working on something. You may have noticed that I have green paint on my palette, but I rarely use green paint for the greens in my landscape. Most tube greens contain phthalocyanine green, which is a cold, powerful green that can easily take over the colors in your landscape, and it's not a very natural landscape green, so I prefer to mix my greens. I'm starting with azo yellow and cobalt blue, and this green looks a little bit too cool for me. Even adding a little bit of yellow, I feel as though it's not warm enough. Most landscape greens actually contain a little bit of red, but if I try to just put red straight into my mixture, it's usually too much. So as a way to control this, I start by mixing an orangey yellow to begin with, and then I'll use that orangey yellow together with my blue to make a warmer landscape green. If you happen to have an orangey yellow to begin with, you can just use that. I'm showing this mixing process because those of you who just have the 5 colors recommended in the supply list might not have an orange yellow. Our first technique is good for a distant tree line. I load my brush with my nice warm green, and I lay it on its side and simply roll it along, which creates a somewhat jaggedy edge on both the top and the bottom edge. This is a good way to suggest both the distant tree line and perhaps some weeds or grasses in the foreground. If I want a softer look in the foreground, I can just moisten my brush and soften that edge as you did in the lesson on softening edges. Next, we're going to just use some brushwork to suggest the silhouette of the tree. In many cases, a simple silhouette is all you need, especially if you're in the distance in a landscape, to suggest your trees. It's certainly not necessary to paint every leaf and branch. Before you begin, remind yourself that real trees are often not terribly symmetrical. We tend to want to paint our trees like this, with a central trunk and a bunch of branches sticking out to the side. But actually, there are branches going away from us and towards us. So often, those branches and their foliage will obscure the trunk. So it works well to just sort of wiggle your brush back and forth and allow the trunk to be suggested by the fact that there's a central area that's darker. I'm not often suggesting the trunk, and when I do, I just keep using the same color that I've used for the branches and foliage. When painting deciduous trees, the usual temptation is to paint each leaf individually like this. But in fact, it works just fine to think about clumps of leaves and again the silhouette of the tree. Dance my brush around, leaving a little bit of white space to suggest the openings that are frequently visible in a deciduous tree. And then if I like, I can suggest a few little branches, and again, I just use the same color that's already on my brush. When I get to the bottom to suggest the trunk, I again continue with the same color. And you'll see that although we know that tree trunks aren't green, this looks just fine. If you'd like to tint it with a little bit of brown or gray, I suggest you drop that color into the wet green so that the two colors will blend together and give a sense of reflected light. I'm also dropping a little bit of my darker color into the wet paint to suggest some shadowing. And then, if I have a little bit too much in a few areas, I'll just use a thirsty brush to bring some of that back out. And here's what it looks like when it's dry. Nice loose suggestions of trees in the distance. I'd like to add that this is not an easy task to master. It takes some careful observation to get your watercolor trees to have the irregularity and character of actual trees. Studying actual trees is a good way to improve your ability to paint trees in watercolor. Because suggesting foliage with brushwork is a challenge, a popular method is to use a sponge to apply the paint. Begin by mixing a nice puddle of strong green paint for your foliage green. We'll use a natural sponge because a kitchen sponge has too many regular edges, and we start by getting the sponge damp. Get it wet and wring it out thoroughly. Now choose a section of the sponge that you like the texture of. You'll notice this is more open, and then if I were to use the top edge, that's more closed. Press the sponge into the paint and stamp it onto the paper. Again, look for an irregular silhouette for your tree. Try not to make it too much of a ball. As before, while the paint's still wet, I like to drop in a little bit of a suggestion of a few branches, a trunk, and maybe some shadow shapes. Don't get carried away. A little of this goes a long way. As you learned in the marbles project, it's also often quite effective to connect objects with their shadows and then separate them later if necessary. Usually with a distant tree, there's no need to even separate it from the shadow. Again, while the paint is still wet, I add a little suggestion of some branches. And if it runs into the surrounding paint, that's actually a good thing because it'll help suggest the shadowing on the underside of the leaf clusters. So I try to do this while the paint is still damp. Now a little suggestion of a trunk and a little of the shadow underneath the tree. Of course, all of this would normally be done on top of some previous painting, as you'll see when we get to our project. But for now, as with most of our lessons, we want to keep things simple, so we're just painting on white paper. For the next technique, we'll need a Holbein brand watercolor spray bottle. I suggest this particular brand because this little bottle is the only one that I've found that gives me the right pattern of droplets. Instead of a mist, I want individual droplets that are scattered over the paper like this, with some dry paper in between. If you have another bottle that gives you this pattern, then it's fine to use it. It's just that the Holbein one is the only one I'm aware of. I call this technique Spritz and Drag because I begin by spritzing the paper with those little droplets that I showed you in the last clip, and then dragging some strong color through the area. To get the little droplets, depress the plunger only a little bit. Don't press it all the way or you'll get a mist. I find that it helps to practice a little bit by spraying on the back of your hand or your towel to see if you've got the right idea before you start spraying on your watercolor paper. As you'll see, the color moves when it hits the droplets of water and produces a more defined line on the dry paper. Let's have a closer look. I'm moving my brush in the same way that I would if I were just painting the tree with brushwork, but because of the little droplets of water, I get some of that irregularity that's difficult to achieve simply with brushwork alone. Here it is one more time, using a darker, cooler green and more of an evergreen tree shape. The challenge with this technique is usually to not get the paper too wet and to keep in mind that the paint may continue to move a little bit after you put it down while it's drying. Resist the temptation to pick up your spray bottle and spray it again if you feel like you're not getting enough movement. That just leads to the whole thing turning into a soggy mess. If you're not getting the movement that you want, the best thing to do is to let the entire thing dry completely and then spritz again and see if you can get a better pattern of droplets. Here's what they look like dry. Notice that some of the colors that we blended have separated a little bit. This actually works really well to give the suggestion of light coming through the outer layers of leaves. The next technique we'll learn is stamping with banding film. This is somewhat related to the sponging technique, except that instead of a sponge, we're going to use banding film to apply our paint. Banding film comes on a roll, and it's used for wrapping up pallets and packaging materials. It's actually the same thing as saran wrap, but because it does not have to be made under food-safe conditions, it's much, much less expensive. So if you're just trying this out, you can just get a piece of saran wrap from your kitchen. But if you like this technique and you start using it a lot, you may want to switch to banding film because it's cheaper. You can buy it wherever packing materials are sold. Just as with the sponging, we dip our banding film into the paint and blot it on the paper. But because the banding film is crinkly, it produces a different type of shape with a little bit more sharp edges and sometimes a bit lacier pattern than the sponging. Just as with a sponge, I add a little suggestion of some branching and some shadowing underneath, and there's our tree. In many cases, this is all you need to suggest trees in the distance. But if you want to add a little more dimension, you can come back and add a second layer after the paint has dried to suggest some shadows. When I do this, I try to make sure that I leave plenty of the original layer still showing and only add a little bit more color in the places where there would be shadows in the tree. Use some restraint because otherwise you'll wind up just with a darker version of the whole silhouette. The same technique works to add a second layer to a deciduous tree. Imagine clumps of leaves and drop in a little bit more color on what would be the underside of the clump of leaves. If you get too much, you can pick it up with a thirsty brush. You can also add a second layer with the sponging or stamping techniques. Again, try to use some restraint so that you just suggest a few shadows here and there. It can be very effective to use more than one of these techniques. So on these trees that we sponged initially, we could come back and add a second layer with the banding film to get a slightly different texture and a little bit more interest in the shadows. Or instead of adding shadows, you may decide that you'd like to extend or reshape the silhouette of the outer part of the tree, putting in some lighter color to suggest the less dense clumps of leaves along the outer edge. Here's what they look like before and after the second layer. Now you know 5 different ways to suggest trees in your watercolor: rolling a brush, using brushwork, using the Spritz and Drag technique, sponging, and stamping with banding film. Play around with these to see which ones work best for you, using them alone or in combinations. We'll put these to work in our next project, Dawn and Dusk on the Lake.